thank you IGM for hosting us and sponsoring this space and pizza and drinks. I'd like to invite, welcome Paul Carvalho, sorry, Carvalho to our session today. Paul has not only been a coach in the community in the GTA area for a long time, but also is currently pursuing psychotherapy studies as well. So please talk to him about that, but put on your Magneto hats when you do. Without further ado, Paul.
This particular talk, sorry, I don't like standing still, so I'm going to walk around. I hope that's okay. This particular talk, Congruent, Agile, Self, and Teams. The last time I did this, it was just Congruent Teams, and afterwards I was like, oh, we're missing something. About 15 years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Jerry Weinberg, and he introduced me to the world of Virginia Satir and several of her models. And for like 15 years, that's been an integral part of my coaching practice and understanding how to interact with people. And these models, which were really centered around how to bring families together and personalities and individuals. Weinberg said, yeah, when you go to work, it's like a dysfunctional family, right? It's like, let's try these models, right? And that was the context in which he presented them, saying. And what I later found out, I've actually done several Satir workshops over the past decade, was that Jerry Weinberg actually worked very closely with Virginia Satir for over a decade, helping her to clarify a lot of her models. This particular one I have used with teams, with individuals, with executives. And the original context in which it existed was with families and personal relationships. I was like, I gotta share this, right? This is one of my most powerful and simple models that I really hope you take away. This idea is like, should this be harder? The answer is no, right? The fact that it is simple is what I really connect with, that Occam's razor idea, like the simplest solution is often the right one. And so, yeah, let's talk about communication. One aspect of why we come together in IT, in teams, is so that we can achieve things together. And there's layers in there. If you're a coach, if you're a leader, a manager, that bringing people together, it's like, well, why don't they work together? What's getting in the way? And these particular models start to sort of get you to question, what are you looking for? How do you know? Okay. So to begin with, actually, curious just to get a general idea of quick word cloud. So yeah, just on your phones, go to menti.com, type in that number, or use the QR code if you like. And let's just build a quick word cloud on what's one word that represents some of the problems that you have in communication. Okay. And so the number's up at the top. Join menti.com, use code. And that code's valid for like a day or two before it recycles. So what one word describes communication failure? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What is its impact? Like some of the range of things that are on here. So we got some feelings coming in: stressful, confused, sadness, dysfunction, ugly. Missing target, concerns about safety, disconnection, frustration. A couple of frustrations. Okay. So I can say that, in over 2 decades of working in IT, we keep saying communication. It's like, well, what does that mean? Right? first let's actually connect with how does it make us feel? Like, what does it look like? So when you see someone who's frustrated, miserable, is your first assumption there's a communication issue? Is it a lack of understanding? Or do you just say, I think you should go for a walk? It's like, well, no, wait, stop. Let's have a conversation. I want to try and understand the source of your frustration. It could be lots of things. Right? But if you're coming to work and you're feeling frustrated because you're not connecting or feeling heard by the people around you, then maybe that's a good time to pause and say, how can we have a good conversation around this? Right? So thank you. Yeah. Okay, so how many people have seen this old cartoon? I have a sad little anecdote down at the bottom. This is no longer available on the internet. It took me an hour to try and find these photos. So that's a little fine print. No, the website is no longer available at this time.
That deserves to be on ChatGPT.
Yeah. I know, right? So, for many of you who've seen this before, there's this idea of it's not showing up. How the customer explained it was something a little bit odd, how the project leader understood it, how the analyst designed it, how the programmer wrote it, what the beta testers received, how the business consultant described it. That looks really comfy, little sunshine rays. How it was documented, what operations installed, how the customer was billed, how it was supported, what marketing advertised, and what the customer really needed is just a tire on the screen. Just let me have it, right? So this speaks to miscommunication throughout a project. What I found was something interesting. As I was trying to find this cartoon, it goes back to the 1960s. The original version has been around for 60 years. Wow. And I was like, that made me sad. Right? I'm like, we haven't fixed this communication problem in 60 years. And I got a new respect for this cartoon. But it just means that we need to be investing more and more time and effort in actually focusing on this. And this is one of the promises of Agile, as we thought too. It's like, hey, small, tight teams, let's get past all of these handoffs and all of these problems. So communication failure, we had that little bubble, all the frustrations and things. Where does it happen? So this is a where question. So we've got business Inc. and we've got people outside. Some of them might be users or customers or regulators, who knows, passers-by. So when we look at communication, it's like, well, here's this team. It's like, surely they must, all be on the same page, right? Or is that an assumption? Right? Because what we find is like, oh, well, there's the business and then there's the team. It's like, oh, but there's the devs and there's the testers, and it's just and so what we find is that there's all these boundaries, and it's the boundaries that creates these little communication gaps and the problems. And even with the sponsors or the managers and the leaders, right? It's like, so we've actually got boundaries everywhere. And when we say that, hey, we are one team, we're all on the same page working towards goal X, but we have dependencies on other teams. I said I was going to challenge the speaker system. There's more handoffs, and we're making the assumption that that team is congruent, that they're all together. Or have you ever communicated with a team and then they drop the ball? Why? It's not that one person's fault, but we make assumptions about, that, hey, as a team, we are working together. Basically, that's where we're going to trip. It's always those assumptions. And here's just some examples. Let's take a Scrum team. And it doesn't matter, Scrum, Kanban, it doesn't matter. This one is just a classic because you'll say individuals and interactions, right? So, where have I heard that before? All right, the Agile Manifesto. So between business and IT, there's a principle that says business and IT should work together daily. Right? Okay, well, the non-Agile things we do, start working on stories without a real shared understanding. Start working on stories with too much written detail, written and assumed up front, no room for thinking, just do it. it's all written out, just do it. So why does this matter? And you can start filling in the gaps, right? Between developers and testers, across teams, you send important messages via email, bug reports, Jira issues. Oh my gosh, there's one company I went into, and I love watching paper trails. I went into a Jira bug report, and it said it was really important. And from the moment it would have been opened until the moment I was reading, I think 2 weeks had gone by, and I said, well, this is really important. Why is it still open? It's because the testers were like overseas and said, here's a critical bug. And it came back, and like the next day, the dev said, can't reproduce. And it went back. And they said, what do you need? And the next day, it's like, well, I don't know, send us the server logs. And then the next day, it's like, which logs? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And this went on for 2 weeks, and no one had worked on it yet, right? So it was entertaining and again sad at the same time. It's like, I don't know, like I raised this as an issue to management saying, stop. Find an overlap. It's always it's not where people are, it's the time difference between them. So you've got to find some overlap, get them talking together in real time, and resolve this. If this is critical, if this is going to impact production or data integrity or something, figure out what's wrong, right? Between teams and their customers and users. Oh, I love this one. I see this an infinite amount of times. You don't collect feedback from your customers and users. Just pushing stuff out. We know what they want. We don't have to ask them if they like it. Your feedback cycle is too long. So in this case, we ask them. But from the time when we originally asked them what they wanted to we deliver it, it's like 6, 12 months have gone by. Is their feedback still relevant? Is that very agile? Or you don't act on any feedback that you collect. You don't change or adapt how you work together or how you deliver products or services. Why are you collecting the data? I've actually gone into companies and told them to stop collecting the data. They said, Paul, you can't possibly recommend that. I'm like, are you doing anything with it? And if the answer is no, there's smart people wasting their time that could be doing other things. Or you could look at that information and maybe adapt to it. But I'm not a big fan of wasting anybody's time and collecting data that you don't use. It's like, well, I don't know what that's good for. How many of you have seen this diagram? It's been around for like 20 years too. So Scott Ambler did an update on the original Alistair Coburn one, and I like this. I keep referencing this, right? Because especially when I teach Kanban, we talk about waste in systems and communication and handoffs. We talk about where's the waste. And so here, this was in the context of Scott Ambler was talking about modeling. And modeling systems, architectures, databases, whatever it happened to be. You could send paper notes and memos. You could, I've seen people record video and send video files back and forth. That actually works in some contexts. Email is very popular, but you see it's kind of like on the low end of effectiveness. I actually slapped instant messaging because I don't know why he left that one out. We think about Slack and Discord and all of the other systems that we use regularly today. Where is that? It's still like half duplex conversations, right? It's like, here, I'm going to type something, and it's going to go out, and I'm going to wait and see who responds. And it's still half and half. We get up to phone conversation, video conversation, and I love this one. This is a coach. I keep scratching my head. It's like you have a Zoom call, a Teams call, and everyone has their video off. And I'm like, welcome to the 1990s. You're having a phone conversation, right? And I remind them that you have not moved yourself up the scale because you're using video technology because no one has it on. Right? So you aren't getting the power of this. And we'll talk a little bit of why, what's underlying that. It's not just as a coach, I want to see people's faces. As a coach, I want to increase the opportunity for people to understand each other, right? And then, what's better than the video conversation? Well, I'm actually being in person. And as a colleague of mine likes to, he elaborates on the neuroscience of that all the time, which is when you are in person as opposed to video, you see this little screen, just my head, it's like, what you don't see is like, someone's tapping, or moving, right? Or if we're talking and you're talking to me and I'm like, well, that's communicating something too. I haven't said anything, but he starts to pick up on body language and stuff like that, right? So, you know, the in-person contact and information is so much higher. Tom?
One of my colleagues pointed something out recently that I thought was right on the money, which is that if people have their video off, they're way more likely to be multitasking,
Yes.
doing something else.
Yes. Yes. And then it goes further down in
Exactly.
terms of communication effectiveness.
Exactly.
Because then we start going on a tangent of multitasking, right? And how multitasking, study after study after study shows your productivity for the context switching goes down, right? You don't have focus. And then, yeah, again, I've got lots and lots of stories here. Communication is more than words, though. So here's where, over the last decade, I've started coming into awareness of more and more neuroscience and models related to how we perceive perception and projection. Really powerful ideas. And this number, on average, keeps coming up. Anywhere from 7 to 10% of communication is in the words that you use. And this has been illustrated to me time and time again. I had a friend like 15 years ago said, Paul, what's the definition of set? And I'm like, I'm not gonna fall into that trap. He's like, why not? It's like, oh, set has like 18 definitions, right? And so if someone uses language, it's this mystery puzzle game where you have to say, okay, this word has 5 meanings, this one has 6, that one has 8, and you're actually trying to find the right path through the language that you use to get on the same page. How do you know that this meaning of words, that we're on the same page? Well, communication, I love this, like, compliment, it's like, okay, bored or, right? It's like when we say the words, they sound similar, but they mean very different things. And it is funny when I pick on people for bad spelling. Like, oh, Paul, let it go. I'm like, yeah, spelling matters sometimes. It's not that I'm picky about it so much as I'm looking at these words, and when there's just one letter off, I'm like, I don't know what they're saying. And at that point, I've given up on asking people about spelling, like, hey, let me just pick up the phone and say, got a sec, I got your message. I just want to make sure we're on the same page here. Right? So that's the words. 10% of the message is in the words. 35% is in the tonality. It's in the volume of what I say. It's the rate at which I speak. It's like, ooh, let me tell you about this one event. When you can hear my voice get faster, and it's like I'm excited, you can hear the passion in it, or it's like, yeah, coming over here was interesting. Yeah. Or I remember the first time I taught an online course, and I asked the awful question of like, did you get the lesson? And they wrote yes. And I was like, was that yes? Was that yes? Was that yeah? And it was like, I saw this word yes, and I'm like, I have to assume I know what you mean and go on, right? But that was a different, I used to be a teacher. I love teaching in person because I can see people, I can hear people. But online, I was like, I see this word and it's lacking and devoid of tonality and that passion and the emotion of voice that we can't hide. Right? And that's not to say that everything we talk about at work is that exciting, but you can certainly tell in someone's voice if they're paying attention. The 55% is physiology. No words required. I love, actually, that set of pictures. But here's the thing, you look at the map, and it's like, even in a phone conversation, that's not half the message. That's 45% of the message. And oh, by the way, if you have audio off, you can still get the full message. And I've seen examples of this. I've done examples of this when people are struggling to get audio on, and I can see what's going on. Like, it's okay, I've got enough. Right? Yeah, I know what's going on, right? Because I can see it. And this is important math to understand, that when we're talking about communication and we think, oh, well, it's written down, surely it's clear. Well, maybe not as much as you think. Don't call me Shirley.
Well, I guess it adds to the complexity on the language that you're speaking, because Mandarin, Cantonese, tonality of the voice vary, and then therefore means something different.
Yes.
If you're coming from another province, your tone of voice is different. It might mean something different to the person that you're talking to. So language also.
Absolutely, absolutely. I thank you for that. So when we introduce cultural awareness into the equation, something I was personally accused of years ago too, is like, oh, Paul, you're always angry. Really? It's like, wow, you're really loud. I'm sorry, I'm excited. And my voice goes up, and that's a cultural thing. And I said, thanks for the feedback, and I'll try to tone it down, but I'm not angry. But someone took it that way because they weren't aware of it. Or, when I learned Japanese many years ago, and it's like, oh, you can take a sentence, and just by raising the tone of the end, you turn it into a question. Right? It's the same words, just like, don't ask me to say my Japanese now, like that's many years out of practice. But how you pronounce things and the lyricalness of the words changes the meanings, and some languages are very much like that too. So yeah, slow down and try to take in the whole person. So this is a greatly oversimplified neuroscience communication model, a meta model. There's a lot that I left out over here. This is the part that's interesting, right? So we are subjected to billions of bits of information every second, and we're not always aware of that. Why are we not aware of it? Because we have functions of the brain that keeps us alive, saying if you actually paid attention to billions of bits of information every second, you'd just melt, you'd explode. So I'm gonna filter stuff out. So for instance, I can ask you a question. Who here is currently aware of the atmospheric pressure being exerted on your body? Right? How many atmospheres is that? 1. So we don't know, but it's there. Part of our body is understanding that we are under 1 atmosphere of pressure. If suddenly a window blew out and that changed, we would be aware. So every second, it's like, hey, look, 1 atmosphere of pressure, ignore it. 1 atmosphere of pressure, ignore it. 1 atmosphere of pressure, ignore it. It's like, hey, look, something interesting happened. You should pay attention to this. So the way this brain function here deletes information that we don't think is important right now, that's okay. The way it generalizes things, it's a survival trait. Most of this is all about survival, right? This is base functionality of the human brain. Generalizing is like, we go back millions of years. It's like, I don't know, can I eat it? Or do I have to run away from it? Like, I'm gonna generalize things. I go into the office, it's like, okay, I meet someone I haven't met before. It's like, friend, foe, I don't know, right? Useful to me, not useful to me. It's like, I don't know, right? So our brains are always generalizing things based on safety criteria. Distorting is interesting. And so like what's happening under here, the models is like, emotional states, hunger state. Have you ever been more short-tempered with someone when you were starving than after lunch? So, there's physical states, emotional states, memories. There's a lot that's happening here that comes into these biases, right? We talk about the role of biases as well. And biases are survival mechanisms. They can be intentionally reprogrammed. There's nothing wrong with biases. If you're human and have a brain, your brain has biases. That's how it's programmed. Prejudices are different, and I make that little line in the sand. Prejudices are biases that are chosen, right? And so that's when you're willfully filtering out information. And that starts to touch on my therapy side of things, right? But here's the thing, it's like, so something happens, lots of information's coming in, we really get it down to like 5 bits, from billions to 5. And then that's when we have another part here that says, what are the rules for responding in this context? And then that's what people hear or see. So, well, and when we choose to only write it in words, how much are we communicating back of what we're thinking and processing or misunderstanding or deleting or distorting, you know, or just don't have the time? Or are we actually communicating everything back, right? So we come up and we want to say, we really should always be trying to maximize the in-person communication as much as possible, right? So this is an interesting slide in that I've left it so much, but it's so central to what's happening and what's going on here. And for me, this is just a key thing. Oh, sorry, picture, okay. So in light of those magic numbers of the 10, 35, and 55, I went back to Scott Ambler's chart, and I'm like, well, let's say, so he just had communication effectiveness in these things, and I'm like, well, you know, if I put 0 to 100 on the side, and I say, well, words is, and I was generous, I said 10%, you know, up to 45%, let's add 35% for tonality and the rest is physiology. Well, then when we get into carrier pigeon, memos, email, instant messenger, this is the realm of communication effectiveness that we're really looking at. Right? Is that when we switch it up to a phone conversation, we can hear the tonality, the speed, the rate, the emotion in people's words. We're in the zone, right? But by the way, here's the 50% mark. I added that there. So even on a phone conversation, there's a certain amount of alignment you need to be with the person to be on the same page. Otherwise, what does the phone conversation give us? And it's almost on par with instant messenger, is the speed of, this is what I heard, and you can get fast feedback to say, oh, no, I really meant this, right? So what I do like is that you're moving up the scale because of the speed of interaction, but it's still one way, and you're still cutting out a lot of the information. Video conversation is up here, again, assuming your video is on. Face-to-face or face-to-face at a whiteboard. Again, this was about modeling, right? So it's like, if we want to make sure we're at the same page, we're going to combine a lot of modalities, a lot of different kinds of information sources. And bringing it back to Agile, it's like, oh, isn't there a principle? Something about face-to-face, blah, 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 blah.
Well, and sorry, it doesn't have to be just modeling at a whiteboard. It's also about the visibility you get with the Kanban board and the system and the sticky note brainstorming or the story maps or whatever else.
That's
so
right. That's right.
There's a lot of, I totally connect with it. It's not just modeling a diagram. It's a bunch of visuals.
So here are some words. Let's go up and let's look at it together, and let's talk about it. That's right. That's right. So you can use the words as a starting point. It's almost as if that was an Agile practice. I don't see it very commonly, sadly.
If you notice, you strike into our heart in IGM. The coaches are really pushing all the stuff what you're saying. Now, assuming you have done a really good job aligning the team, they are persistent team members. They're staying together as a Scrum Kanban group working together, and they have a good alignment. They're almost connected mentally.
Yeah.
I guess that number will vary depending on, regardless of the channel that you're using.
Yes. Absolutely. Here's a non-technical example that happened to me just a couple of days ago. My son came home, it's really late, it was around midnight. I was up waiting for him and we were just chatting, and then I was trying to formulate a question, and all I got out was the word when. And I was thinking, what are the words that come after the word when? And he waited about 30 seconds, and then he gave me the answer that I was looking for.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's it, thank you, son. And so, yes, when you achieve that level of congruence and alignment, then you are far more flexible on this scale, right? And this is where, you can be in alignment on instant messenger between people who are on the same page, but just beware the assumptions inherent. What assumptions do we make about shared understanding and communication effectiveness through the channels you regularly use? So if you find two people who are communicating and they're on the same page, and then you say, oh yeah, Slack is perfect. Well, maybe not for everyone in every situation. So, and that's where this comes with a caution sign, is that yes, when you are congruent, and that's the center of this particular talk, then communication becomes easier. But this is just a warning page more than anything else. So here we get to the Virginia Satir congruence model. The first time I saw it, like, is that it? That's it. We're going to keep coming back to this. Just a circle 3 parts: self, other, and context. And then it's just, how do we use this? How do we apply this? So the basic definition is we say we are congruent when we balance self, other, and the context. That means that we can communicate at that moment congruently. Our verbal and body language express the same message. I mean, are there some people that you know, it's like say one thing and do another? You're not acting congruent. You're aware of this, which means how much do you trust that person? Right? And this is where there are layers here that when I started to understand, right? Virginia Satir said an oversimplified definition of congruence is that one looks like one feels, says what one feels, and means and acts in accordance with what one says. Such congruence develops trust. And when we are in corporate environments, there's a lot of hidden agendas. There's a lot of fear and scapegoating and blame and shame. And there's a lot of other emotions that put people in reserve. But then we say, trust is really important on the team. Like, is it that easy? We can't just throw out the word. From Jerry Weinberg, being whole and total involves the principle of integrity. This means that all of our various parts, including our physical, emotional, and spiritual components, are working together harmoniously. And I've seen people come in who have had a really bad day, and then they're trying to put on a brave face, and I'm like, what do you need? It's clearly not your best day to be here at work. I can see you trying, but I can feel your pain. I can see that you're hurting as well. And we make mistakes sometimes when we're not whole. Gene McClendon, there is no more powerfully positive intervention into the human system than congruent communication. Accordingly, it is both a means and an ends to quality in relationships, performance, health, and spirituality. And that word quality jumped out to me. Obviously. Quality is a topic near and dear to my heart that goes back into the 90s, maybe earlier than that. Right? It's always trying to understand what is quality. And it's like, well, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Jerry Weinberg had a definition. Quality is value to some person at some time. Then it sort of elaborates, like someone who matters at some point in time. And it's like, well, then how do you prioritize things? And that's a whole other talk. But when I saw quality in relationships, I was like, well, there's got to be a connection here. We see words like integrity, trust, quality, performance. We're pulling this out from this circle. Before we talk about what this can do for us, let's look at what it means not working correctly, which is what we tend to see. So we call coping stances. Coping stances are, we are coping with bad behavior. And we don't always know that we're doing it. Sometimes we do. But when we are not in balance, we're likely to cope with change in an unbalanced, less effective way. One of the first ones is like, I don't care about you, I don't care about that other. So there's this blaming stance, right? It's like, and you can see in people's words and actions, it's being projected onto others. When the self doesn't matter, oh no, it's all about you. This is the important thing. It's like we talk about yes men and the entourage. It's like, oh, but you're the whole world. You're all that matters. Like you are also not in balance. Some people might like that, but that's not someone I could trust either. Super reasonable. Has anyone ever said to you, it's like, yeah, what you think doesn't matter, what I think doesn't matter, there's a process, we just gotta follow it. It sounds super reasonable, but in reality, you're discounting the humans in this equation. Maybe that's not a healthy, balanced thing for us to do either, right? And yeah, sometimes they, are the pretend experts. which may hide blaming, confusion, or helplessness, right? So this may be, again, a coping mechanism. It's like, well, I don't want to blame anyone, so I'm going to fall back on the standard operating procedures. Irrelevant. This one is funny, which is none of that matters. It's like, hey, how are you doing today? Well, the stock market went up 15 points. I don't see the connection, right? But interestingly, as a coach, I have done this too, intentionally, when people get stuck. They're so focused on a particular problem, and then they ask me something, and I do a dad joke where I take one word and I totally flip the meaning, and it breaks them out of this concentration state enough to laugh, and then they can go back into it. Because, you know, when you talk about creative problem solving, there is a moment of incubation where you have to stop forcing yourself to get a solution. You need to stop and think about it. And so I can actually apply this as a coach intentionally. And people say, Paul, that's not relevant. But yeah, I know. But be careful how you wield that, because there are people who will just be misdirecting you all the time. Yes?
Just a question. So I realize people have their own personalities and they have their own problems, but it seems that there's something implicit here, which is the leadership that makes the work situation that people are functioning in. You were talking about, you know, people in corporate situations, sometimes there's a lot of hiding of things or backstabbing or this or that. These are the things they think they need, and they're probably right that they need these things. And that's because of a situation that's been set up because of the leadership, or, you know, that's been created from above, right?
That's right.
So I'm wondering how that fits in, and how it, each of us trying to fix ourselves only goes so far if you're still in a situation where you're not feeling safe for external reasons.
Right. Excellent question. There are many layers to that. From someone here in the room, who shall not be named, Chris, and introduced me to the origin of the org chart from, like, you know, what, almost 200 years ago now. And the org chart is literally a blame chart. So every organization that has an org chart is built and founded on blame and scapegoats and failure. And it's all about who to blame when something goes wrong. We try to put a positive spin on it and say, oh, there's a positive reporting structure. You need to talk to that person. You know, you can always talk to managers and stuff like that. No. Everything about the org chart is based on negative emotions. And so people are walking into these environments trying to do their best. We're all, most of us, inherently guilty of wanting to do a good job, right? And sometimes we're hired because we're passionate about the work that we do. And we want to connect with colleagues. And we are standing in a river that is raging around us, and we don't know why. So the only thing we can do knowingly is try to understand ourselves and try to have a measure of understanding of the impact we have on people around us. But we are always standing in this current of blame and toxicity in any organization, because that's how they're built. They're structured that way.
I'm wondering if you do a lot of work with executives, like coaching with them, because they're really the ones.
I do. And it's funny.
They have the same goals.
I also had a moment like last year of, you know, insight and awareness and sadness when I was coaching someone very high in an organization. And I said, well, what's keeping you from doing this thing that you think would benefit the people in your departments and your business lines of business? And I said, well, Paul, you know what? Hands are tied. Like, who's above you? There's one person left. And it's like, yeah, and that person's hands are tied because then there's a board above them. And so, again, it comes down to the structure, and we are all prisoners in that structure. And there was a sense of hopelessness. And it's not to say that I won't keep having those conversations, but just know that they have a lot of the same feelings of their hands are tied as well when they're stuck in organizational politics and dynamics and structures. So this awareness, this tool, and again, I teach this to execs. How do you know you're on the same page with your direct reports? How do you know that your messaging is coming across and being received by a wider audience, right? And very simple model, be careful blaming, and they're like, oh, I can see this, and I know that person does this, and this, right? And it's like, oh, if the risk people, yeah, we've got these security policies, you've got to follow it, I don't care what you think. I'm like, well, you know, yes, and, right? Speaking as a former auditor, it's like, I know that there is some room for interpretation and or reinterpretation in certain contexts. So there's nothing wrong with having expertise and understanding these, but also understanding the human parts and how progress impacts things going forward. So let's start to apply it in the office. So there's like 3 layers, one-on-one.
Paul, yeah.
Yes.
I was just curious if there's a recommendation for what companies should do instead of having an org chart. Are there some other, like besides just completely getting rid of it, are there some other ways around having an org chart?
There are. So that's a much bigger conversation. So alternatives to org charts. The larger the organization, once you pass that Dunbar model, the number, right? Like, what is it? 150, 200, 250-ish people. The Dunbar model says that you're now coming into a workplace where you actually don't know the name of everyone around you. So you have to have a certain amount of structure in order to keep it running. So when we're talking about small organizations, you really don't need a lot of structure. Right? And that's why we talk about startups. It's like everyone wears multiple hats is kind of the colloquial phrase. But the larger an organization gets, it's like, how do we know that we're all on the same page? And there are organizations and there are stories of how some companies, regardless of the size, do get together in person, like for major events. And there's a lot of power in putting people together. But when it comes to, alternatives, I would say that I have some ideas, but that does take us a little bit off the path. Yes, Chris?
There's one. You can look at Gordon Associates. So they were one of the first organizations decades ago to look at the lattice style of organization. So if you joined Gordon Associates and you have an MBA, you'd go and meet Mr. Gore when he was still alive. And say, Tom, pleased to meet you. It's really great. Glad that you're here to join this organization. I see you have an MBA. That's great. So does everybody else. Go and explore the company, see what you can do. And literally, that's it.
Yeah.
That's your interview. Now you go and you try to find your way in the company and become an internal entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So that's what you became. That's why it was called Gordon Associates, is you literally got added to N+1 the associate. And it wasn't unusual that you'd be expected to pick up the phone, talk to customers, do those kinds of things. Even Gore himself would do that. But that's a very different kind of organization. Culture follows structure. So Bill intentionally structured his company that way from the get-go. In a lot of organizations that start off with a hierarchical structure, you're going to introduce a lot of disruption as soon as you decide, oh, let's adopt a flattened hierarchy. That sounds great. I worked for a company a couple of years ago, totally virtualized, who told me, we have no managers here. We hate managers.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this ought to be good, because then I found about 120 managers. Everybody's a manager, right? So eventually, people will find a way to organize themselves. If you try to say there is no organization here, you'll find there is an emergent organization that's going to happen. It's going to have queen bees, king bees, and all these other things. So this is really good stuff that you're getting into, because this is what I see in my work as well, is the influence of the structure of the relationships that are inside an organization influencing. So often what I say is Agile runs right up against the old model of management. The reason Agile transformations fail, why there's so much friction, it's right in here. Paul is getting to the good stuff here. This is exactly
why safe. So
that. Yeah. Why doesn't safe, or why doesn't anything? Why did holacracy face plant?
Oh, did holacracy place back?
Oh yeah.
Any questions?
And no, I just wanted to add that there is body of work that is coming right now in terms of science that looks at multi-team systems and distributed leadership. So there are models that are explored and looking at different type of corporations and how do they solve different things. And that's where talking about borders or boundaries. It's a boundary spanner, so it's another term that came up, and how those things can be mitigated in organizations.
Thank you. And that was where I sort of like paused and I'm like, okay, I know this, but I don't want to go there right now. But
Keep going.
yeah. So congruent action. So we talked about some of the unhealthy coping stances. So this starts to ask, this is how we use it, right? Which is, how do you know that you are on the same page with someone else? So it's just a one-on-one side of things, right? So the self becomes me, and the other here is the other person. So how do we know that we're on the same page, that same context? And I love these three questions. It's like a trifecta. What does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? Right? Because someone can say all the right things. And this is where like I'm a master at interviewing people. It's like someone can have all the right words. And I'm like, cool. And then my gut's just, something's a little off. And it means like I've got to pay attention to my gut brain, right? Which means that I haven't got all of the answers yet. Something else is there. So, and like you should be listening to your head, your heart, your gut, because each one is telling you different pieces of information, right? Where the gut often represents the unconscious. You want to repeat this process until you've achieved a sense of understanding with everyone in your group, everyone in your immediate sphere. And so, here's some examples. Between business and IT, how do we know that we're congruent? What does that look like? What does that sound like? Product goal, vision, user stories, definition of quality. The activity of coming together and aligning on this vision and with these tools, what do? They help to put us on the same page. So it's not the artifacts that matter, but it's the action of saying, what's important to you? Do you know what's important to your users and customers and stakeholders? Let's have these conversations. And oh, by the way, the fact that we have an artifact, a document, that's a milestone. But then let's do this again in 6 months, or whatever the period is that we feel there's a time limit on this understanding at the present moment. Example 2, between developers and testers. How do we know that we agree on scope and design? Do we even understand that we're not on the same page? What are bugs? By definition, what are bugs? Bugs are indications that my interpretation of how the system should work doesn't work. But does your understanding of your interpretation of how the system works align with how the developer who built it or the user who expects to use it? How do we know? So we end up closing a lot of these bugs saying, not relevant. Like, well, then you wasted everybody's time, right? So again, each one of these artifacts represents really good conversations and opportunities to ask these questions. How do we know we're on the same page with each other? And then what does that look like afterwards? Among the whole team, a team mission, shared goal, collaboration. What does collaboration look like? Modeling. So let's come together, let's work on the same thing together. That's kind of cool. Or do we have a team of 8 people and we don't talk to each other, but we hand off information one person at a time? How much congruence and alignment do we have? And if we don't have that kind of shared understanding amongst people next to us that we depend on, what are the responses and behaviors going to be like towards each other? Is that trust? And if we don't have trust, how much do you trust the output and the outcomes of what we're trying to accomplish together? So it starts with this level of one-on-one conversations. Across teams, how do you know that your whole team, so let's assume for a moment, you gave the description earlier, well, as a team, we're on the same page, cool. Now, let's take that to how do we know we're on the same page with other teams? So the self is, I'm going to pop in, our team, we are on the same page. How do we know we're on the same page with other team X, team Y? It's like, okay, well, between development teams, do we have handoffs? Do we collaborate? Do we come together? Is there alignment in words, actions, outputs? Are we in alignment with leadership? Are we in alignment with other support groups? And again, what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? Anyone ever said, I don't want to talk to that team? What information does that tell you? Right? Congruent action with external users. So let's assume for a moment, and again, the smaller the organization, the easier this is, that we are all together, but how do we know we're on the same page with our external partners, with our external vendors, with our external customers, with our external whomever it happens to be? And that's a big assumption here. Right? Big assumption. Because if we're broken here, trying to be in alignment with people outside our organization, that's really hard. And that's going to be flaky and broken. Again, can you tell what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? And I love this one. This is a math nerd alert. Congruency does not mean that everything looks the same. So I dug out an old grade 10 math book and looked up congruent triangles. And I love this because test for congruency in math and geometry says, hey, as long as any of these rules, then the triangles are technically congruent, but they don't look the same. Not always, and that's okay. So that means that we can be congruent with different people and that can look differently, but we can still be on the same page. I might tell jokes to one person and be serious to another person, but we still have trust. And then you try to joke with a serious person and that doesn't work out. Right? So be careful of the assumptions that we make. The standard operating procedures, beware the super reasonable people saying, well, I apply the rules, therefore, there's both angles, therefore we must have a congruence. As coaches, I like to observe people and judge that for myself. It's not about have you been following the rules, do I see that in the people, do I feel that? And you can feel that. As an example of this, I came up with what I call the smile test. I was doing some technical coaching a few years back. We were doing some behavior-driven development with a team, and the whole team had spent 30 minutes trying to come up with a really decent scenario. And it was on the board, and so I was like this, and I was standing at the board, and the teams, maybe 8 people, they were all looking at it, and I said, okay, we just spent a half hour coming up with this scenario. What do you all think about it? And their faces were like yours. And I'm like, okay, no one's smiling. Right? I'm like, okay, smile test. I'm not feeling it. Right? I said, how can we make this better? Right? And then I went and I gave the marker to someone. And they're like, oh, you want me to do something? I'm like, yeah, come on, touch the board. Do something. Right? And then 3, 4 people were at the board and said, well, what about this? What about this? And 15 minutes later, they stopped, they sat down, and again, I took my position at the front, and I was looking at them all. I'm like, what do you think about this scenario? There were no words, but the smile test told me they were congruent with each other, and there was a level of communication happening and shared understanding that I loved. Right? So again, I relied on physiology alone to give me the answer to that question.
Well, interesting because there are some methodologies out there like a test-driven development when you try to create that congruency, really involving the people at the end of the chain, at the end of the supply chain, saying, "No, come on, let's bring them really at the front,"
yes.
And then we start creating that congruency really early,
yes.
So we maintain that cohesiveness of the process we go.
Yes.
So I could see that there is few methods out there that allow that to spawn naturally, really at the beginning of conforming teams.
That's right. We start to break down some of those ideas of the structure of the flow of information. We start to meet people
really early on the stage.
Because why? Because we want to be on the same page. We don't want to waste time and find out that we delivered the wrong thing at the end. That's right. That's right. Start breaking down those assumptions that we must deliver things in a certain order. And we're going to explore that after the break with some structured examples too. So summary, how do you know you're on the same page with others? Again, it keeps coming down to this circle. You don't have to write it down. It's you'll know it. There's 3 parts. There's me, there's you, and are we on the same page? Self, other, and context. So it starts with you. Are your thoughts, feelings, words, and actions in alignment? And that's a very personal introspective. And we need to be open to feedback from people who matter to us, not just anyone saying, hey, Pete, can I give you some constructive criticism? The answer is no. It's I do not like and or appreciate and or respond to criticism. By its very nature, the word is negative. I am going to tell you something negative about you. That doesn't tell me anything about me, that tells me something about the giver, right? So if I were to say, hey Peter, can I give you some feedback? What's that? Be curious, right? So the thing is, if someone offers you some feedback, some information, yes, but you have to be careful when receiving feedback. What's the emotional state of the person who's giving it, right? And that's, again, another longer conversation, but, being open to feedback enables us to see parts that are in our blind spot. That might give us personal insights into why we do things that maybe we don't always know. But this is the thing, is that if someone is saying, yeah, when you said this, but your face was tripping you up and it looked like something else. I'm like, oh, I was thinking about this other thing, you're right. Okay. Or maybe not, and I was like, I don't know what's going on. So it starts with you, openness, courage, focus. We talked about this here. If we're not focusing, how do we know we're paying attention to ourselves? Self-respect, self-compassion, huge part of the other psychotherapy world that I'm working in is people don't know how to do this. Sadly, this is not as popular as it should be, is self-kindness. We beat ourselves up and we make mistakes and we dismiss those opportunities when we do something right. Oh, that's not balanced, right? So openness, courage, focus, self-respect, that leads to integrity. And from a place of integrity, we can then build on that, right? We can say, oh, are we congruent as a team? So now that I'm congruent, are we congruent? Right? Can I trust you? And or what does it look like to build trust with other people? Boy, you're smart. The third layer on top of this, connect to the world. If I'm congruent, we're congruent, then what does it look like and or mean to connect with and be on the same page with the world? And for me, that's the heart of what I call quality. Is that can you have quality if you don't trust the people who are building things? Can you have quality if you don't trust the people you're working with? And the answer is no. So foundationally, and this is the part that took me years to understand from Jerry Weinberg's work, is like quality is inherent in the quality of the relationships you have with yourself and with others. And so for me, drawing it this way, it's like same core diagram just being applied sort of outwards. This is the part that for me was very insightful. For me, this is kind of like the part that I want you to take away with and we'll build on afterwards. So that kind of brings us to the end of this portion. Temperature reading. So I no longer ask the question, any questions? So this is my any questions page, which is there anything that's still puzzling to you? Is there anything that you thought was an aha? Any complaints that you have, plus a recommendation or hopes and wishes? Yes.
What's fascinating, my husband's a retired teacher and I got 2 kids in school. He's always saying that when you do essays or answer questions, the teachers are always asking for, you've read a book or something like that, or seen a movie, video, you write about connection to self, connection to other, and connection to the world. So that same model, I think the school systems are using.
Cool. Thank you.
A lot of what you talked about, I wonder how many leadership courses there are out there that don't actually cover this for leaders.
The leaders I've personally coached didn't know about this.
I don't know.
The information has absolutely resonated to me on so many levels. Right now I'm in a situation at work where I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now because I need to make sure that multiple teams from different levels are on the same page. So I'm a vendor, and I'm seeing disconnections between my client, between my management, and then from my management within my teams. So right now I'm like, everything makes sense. I guess my question, or what I hope I can take away after this, is where do I start? Because it's a mess. And
where do you think you might want to start if we look at this?
Well, what worried me the most a few minutes ago is when you asked if I trust the people that I'm working with right now. And I definitely at the very ground level, I have no trust in my own team. So answers the question, I guess.
And if you are feeling courageous and open, you can ask and invite feedback as well, which is there anything I can do to help build trust in me as well? Right? Is that if you're not feeling it from them, ask the question. It's like, trust is one of those things. I love as a coach going into, a team or a group, and I remember this one product owner said, you've got to earn trust. I'm like, nope, it doesn't work that way. He's like, Paul, we're not going to listen to you until we trust you. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work that way. Trust has to be given. You have to take that leap of faith. You have to offer and invite it in order to appreciate it. You can never earn it because there will always be conditions that you don't know, right? And so if you don't know whether or not you can trust these people around you, you can ask the question, do you trust me? Is there something I can do to be or seem more trustworthy to you? Invite that personal focus, and it lightens the question for others as well, right? So if they understand that you're making an effort to be trustworthy and open and mindful, that starts to build some of those relationships.
I was, in my experience as a coach and then also as a developer, as a director, manager, managing people, I always come to the conclusion that congruency, if it's not there, it's gonna fail. And then because humans are by nature are complex, and with our nature limits ourselves to few channels of communication, really poor channels of communication. We have 5 cents only, and sometimes you might see a 6th one. So if we don't build on trying to get mastering that alignment with others, we're set for failure. And then just of the last, you mentioned something really interesting. When you show that humility as a person, that opened the door for trust. Because now we're talking on the natural level of every person. You are alive, you're made of flesh, you bleed, you go to the bathroom, you do the same thing that I do. So we are human. So when you reach at that level, that opens the door for that kind of trust, and then start nurturing whatever comes after that, which is great.
Thank you. And I would and that to say, we come into organizations with a lot of hopes and wishes and our true selves, and we have that beaten out of us through a lot of stress. And then we just go back into coping stances about safety and security, and it's horrible, right? It's like, well, because then you are a whole person and you're bringing that feeling home to family, to friends, to pets, to whomever it is that is outside of that work life. We can't just compartmentalize that feeling there. It becomes part of us, right? So yeah, when we can show that vulnerability and humility and open ourselves, it is a much more natural state. Collaboration is a natural human activity that for some reason we have procedurally removed from functionally structured organizations, right? I mean, you just look at a daily stand-up and you ask every single person what they're working on. You can't have a more irrelevant question than what are you working on, what are you working on, what are you working on? What are we going to deliver at the end of the week is the only question that matters.
Yeah.
The instant you see someone asking each individual person, you do not have congruence in that group. Right?
Well, lazy man's question, if you go back to the previous diagram, so to me the starting point is that one where I need to find where I am before I'm going to look into even number 2, let alone number 3. So any shortcuts, any tricks to the trade, any kind of quick checks to say 5 minutes while I'm brushing my teeth in the morning, let me check where I am before I walk into the office?
That's a good question. That's actually really hard to answer. Because
that's why I asked it.
We start to find more psychological
Lazy man
models.
question, eh?
I don't have a picture and I don't have a way to feel it. There's
This may help, and it's just worth exploring. I've been reading this book called 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. There may be some tips there. I'm still learning, so I'm not good enough at it to even explain. But there are some tips there. So out of the 15 commitments, one of them is, recognizing your emotional state as you are. And then there may be some, I think, 3 to 5 questions they give to help do a check-in. And then also even some exercises that can help you move or shift your state. Before you shift, you have to recognize and then acknowledge and say, this is where I am. And then you may go to say, what helps me get out of this state to a state of more pleasantness? Take a walk, take a swim, whatever might be more natural to you. There's some things there. Yeah.
That feels like the responsibility process.
Very similar, very much informed and based on it.
It's very much overlapping.
Yes.
This part here, and this is why answering your question, there's layers to it. What information are we generalizing, distorting, and deleting? So, for instance, if you don't feel you have high emotional intelligence, just as one facet, you don't have the language for recognizing those emotions within yourself or in others, you're automatically going to delete it and discard that information. And so you're excluding a huge portion of information that is critical in understanding the state of yourself and others. And this is why emotional intelligence, for instance, starts to say, no, this information I'm paying attention to, right? So emotional intelligence kind of has those 2 layers. And am I aware of, in the moment, my current emotional state, which when you're brushing your teeth is probably okay. But for instance, if you're brushing your teeth and you're already anxious about what's coming up later, it's like, okay, well, I'm not focused on my teeth. I'm bleeding gums by the end of this, right? But here's where, are you aware of your current emotional state? Do you have the language to understand, recognize, and or respond to that? Because if the answer is no, then that information will be projected to others and you don't have that language. You don't even know that you're doing this. So this is where understanding how I can be more whole necessarily requires being open to feedback. And you need to trust the people who are giving you that feedback, right? Saying, oh, why did you ignore that information? What information? Right? That's right, because we just don't have the language for it. Right? And this is why when I do a lot of leadership coaching, I start with the fundamentals. Are you aware of your own emotions? Like, we're not talking about emotions. Like, yeah, you know what, we are. Because if you start looking at layers of the brain, you've got the primal, it's the limbic system. It's like, there's only like 3 things that it's focused in on. And right now, we are hardwired for survival. That's it. And if we don't do things at the higher layers, this is the part that fundamentally takes over in our brain, is survival mode. On top of that is another part of the brain that focuses on and communicates through emotions. Oh, and by the way, that part taps into your whole body. You can't hide emotions. You think you can, you can't. But that part that speaks through emotions doesn't have language. That's part of the neocortex, the new brain. That's where we are soft-wired for communication. We are hardwired for survival. And when you think you can think your way out of any problem and ignore the emotions, well, yeah, you know what? Your emotions are going to take over you. And everyone is going to see that, right? So this is why you have to be open to feedback, to understanding and appreciating things that you aren't aware that you're doing, but you're constantly communicating and projecting that, right? And so that's why I said there's a lot not covered here, but that's just one example of what can I do to help be more congruent. It really does start with building a relationship with someone you trust and say, can you give me feedback on how you think that went?
No, just break one after the next question.
I don't know if it's just me, but I'm getting a sense that there's a kind of a internal family systems thing going on. I don't know if that is, if I'm reading that into it or if it's there, but I kind of...
So I do see things that way because that's from the Virginia Satir world, which is, do we understand the parts of ourselves, the executive functions, ego states? There's a lot of different language. When she uses the word internal family systems, it's this idea of, and there's many examples of this, we aren't really in control of ourselves on a daily basis. We have delegated portions of our functioning to parts of our brain that just knows how to do it unconsciously, such as I'm not consciously thinking about breathing or standing or blinking. There's automatic brain systems that do these sorts of things. Oh, you know what? There's an automatic system that knows how to brush my teeth. There's an automatic system that knows how to drive a car.
Do PowerPoint presentations.
Do PowerPoint presentations, right? So it's the kind of thing where there's all of these executive functions. When you are talking to me right now, you see, oh, hey, here's this Paul guy. He's the presenter. Here's a title. He's a coach. He's a therapist. Let's give him titles. When I go home, I am a husband. I am a father. When I visit my mom, I am a son. You know, like internally, I have all these different ideas of self. How do I know I am in harmony? When the taxes are coming up, it's like, oh, I'm also worrying about taxes. I'm a tax guy and finance guy for myself so that I stay out of jail. That's important too, right? So it's like we have different internal systems, and if they're not operating in balance and harmony with each other so that they can switch healthily and come back as needed, then that's when we have imbalanced states. And that can manifest itself in many different ways. That goes a little bit further. Yes?
I actually thought that was insanely insightful. We were recently launching a campaign at work. 15 people worked on it, very simple campaign, and we had loads of errors and issues across the board. And I think seeing that diagram just helped me put into perspective why we lack quality at work. It's not the right people, it's not the right talent. It is simply the lack of self and others in our scenario.
Yeah. We can hire a lot of talented people and then put them in a situation where they don't communicate, trust each other. They're still smart. And we did this to them. Right? Yes?
So another thing I like that it's something that you pointed out, it's the fact that self-awareness is important, but it's something we don't get educated on, and it's not part of, we are habitual creatures, let's put it that way, but it's not within our habits. So that taps into Oria's question, where if you don't make it a habit to ask yourself, and you can use different models to figure out how to ask those questions. There is the believe, think, feel, act type of model that you can think, oh, what am I believing in today? Am I going to get this done or not? What do I think about it really? What do I feel about that? And what do I act? So there are different ways to do it, but it's getting it as a habit and then challenging it. And I think that's the other thing. Once I'm aware that I don't believe this will get done, why don't I believe it can be done? And that uncovers other layers of your biases or filters.
What are we ready to hear about ourselves and reflect on and consider other options? And it requires, again, a trusted relationship to get that feedback, but it requires that we do understand this notion of self-reflection, which is not a common thing that we do.
It's not taught.
We don't talk about it, we don't do it.
It's not part of MBA.
That's right. So before we begin, participation is optional but encouraged. So probably want you to get into groups of 6 to 8 people at tables-ish, more or less, for this first activity. Be respectful, have fun. The thing with having fun is it keeps coming back for me. I've been a coach in companies where they said, there's no fun at work. And the funny thing about the science of play is that play requires you to be present and here and in the moment. And when you do, you have maximized the amount of awareness that you have, your awareness potential. So have fun. All right, so this first activity, we won't have time for the next one, but save that for another day. We're going to play broken telephone. 5 minutes. See. Okay, so tables, groups of like 6 to 10 people. Choose someone to go first. So you can do that by either, I want to go first, or you can always spin a pen and whoever points to, like, voila, it doesn't really matter. So when you have a starting person, so let's start there. Like, are you in groups-ish of 6 to 8? That's one bit? Okay, well, consider batch size from Kanban. Smaller batches, work a little faster, but this could be entertaining too. So who's the starting person? So raise your hands, the starting person in each group. No volunteering, people. Okay. All right. So starting person, you have like 2 jobs. One is think of something that made you smile in the past day or so. So a phrase, not a word. You can't just say lunch. Which might be true, but expand a little on that. You know, limits to about a sentence and avoid specific or identifiable names. So just give you a second to think about something that made you smile in the past day or so. Got something? Okay. So I'm going to need you to be a timer. So is that in this? Oh, yeah. Okay. No. All right. So you're going to be the timer. Oh, I think I specifically. No, wait. This one doesn't have a timer. Sorry, I'm getting confused with the next activity. There's no timing in this one. Okay. So pick a direction, left or right. Doesn't matter to me. But whoever the starting person is, I'm going to ask you to quietly and privately whisper that only once to the person next to you. No repeats, and then they repeat it to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, and just when you are done going all the way around, just raise your hand, and the last person, say aloud what you heard, and then the person who started say what they started with. All right, let's just go. All right, so a quick debrief. So we'll expand on this a little. It doesn't have to be after a table. Some questions. Was the message integrity preserved throughout? So no, and yes. Very good. For how many steps do you think the starting message remained the same?
0.
0. 2. Right. How often do you think it changed?
10 times.
You guys aren't even trying over there.
And I wrote a why question. I don't like why questions, but the reason was because I was limited in space. What do you think contributed to that, was what I mean by the why? Or what might have influenced that change and in what ways? So we've played this game before. It illustrates a lot of different lessons. I'm going to jump into, the next one was illustrations. And we'll jump into the general debrief questions. So this simulated a spoken contract communicated through an organization. The idea of whispering it to one person means that you are isolated in time or space or distance or whatever it happens to be from other teams. So I can have a conversation with Tom one day in one place. And so we're not whispering, but we just have a whiteboard conversation. He said, oh, and he talks to Horia, like, oh, he's like, that's great. It's like, but now this message is being communicated, and we don't know that we're playing the perfect telephone game. Right? But how many of you have heard, oh, there's no documentation in Agile? So that's bad Agile. That is not Agile. Right? But this is what's happening when people adopt Agile. They think, we don't need to write anything down. We'll just pass it on through verbal conversations. Well, we just kind of illustrated how that leads to communication failures. The second game takes about 15 more minutes, was written only. And we alternate between written and drawing. Say, oh, surely if we have miscommunication, we'll have more words. That'll help. Does it? No, it doesn't. It's an epic fail with a heck of a lot more laughing. But that's a wonderful best practice. So here we have two ends of the extremes, both fail. So, general open questions for you is, what might we do to achieve congruent communication and shared understanding? The example here is, let's say, product requirements. What might be some challenges of that? You know, how might you detect incongruence? How might you help others notice, or how might we celebrate congruence? And people forget to celebrate positive communication, but that's a positive reinforcement. Yes?
Oh, I don't know if you wanted to answer the
No,
question.
just any of those, just jump in.
Yeah, like, I mean, we weren't allowed to repeat. So you weren't allowed to go back and forth and say, huh? Can you clarify? Oh, now I understand. So, or I think I understand. I heard you say this. And then I pass it on to the next guy.
Okay.
Recognizing that people understand, learn, and communicate differently, and then answering the first question, I think we have to take advantage of every single channel out there to connect the dot and maintain that congruency. So visual, videos, Kanban boards, infogradiators, written stuff, name it, because people sort information differently. And they, as long as we maintain that information well connected, you maintain that congruency.
I mean, naturally, yes, how you absorb information varies. Maybe a question is how do you create a fair balance, right? Sure, everyone's a different winner, but in the workplace, how do you create fair balance without adding additional work?
I love the
Sorry,
implied or inferred boundary and constraint without adding more work. And that's because we have certain constraints of time and scope that are inflexible. Therefore, trying to change up the process of communication to ensure richer understanding is going to bounce up against those constraints. Right? And so this is where we come back to this idea of the system that we're in is somewhat inflexible, and it makes it harder to achieve that level of congruence. We shouldn't have to feel that stress that, well, I really want to talk with you more, but I gotta go. I gotta be at my desk, I gotta type. So I hear what you're saying.
So something that I used early in my career that I learned about was dialogue mapping. And that's one way of taking argumentation. One of the problems that we've got in communication is this fidelity issue. Do we actually understand what we're talking about? And when you get into groups, there are behavior patterns, like you might have the individual who continually feels unheard, so they keep repeating the same point and sucking the oxygen out of the room. Well, dialogue mapping is a visual argumentation method. It puts it up on a screen, you can do it up on a whiteboard, and it starts with a question. So like, for example, with Tom, we asked the question, what made you happy recently? So that starts like with an open-ended question. They're usually open-ended questions, and then they'll have responses, and it's going for drinks with my brother. Now the thing about this is it tells us what the argumentation pattern was in our communication. It lives better than a written email, because we could have 3 or 4 or 5 of the people at the table, the 6th, 7th, or 8th person. We can invite them, and any of us can actually explain the argumentation and say, well, Tom, you said it was going for drinks with your brother. We could actually have another question that comes from that. Where did you go? What was it about where you went that made you happy? Was it a particular drink? There's argumentation that follows. So if you're able to have a way to be able to explain that with a diagram that you can share and that you've got shared understanding and communication around you built, that helps take that starch out. I've used it. It's a little bit of a lost art to use because this is something that was popular, good grief, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Jeff Conklin invented it. You can get a book, still available on Kindle. And there used to be a tool. It lays it out like a mind map, so it's called Compendium. But you can use a mind map with it. But the whole point is start with a question, come up with some answers. Answers have pros and cons to them. Share that map. It's pretty easy.
Facilitation techniques.
Yeah.
Thank you. So one of the things that, again, the model, the simplicity of the model doesn't change, but these last two, how might you detect incongruence? And those 3 questions, what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? Right? And how might we celebrate it, Tom?
I mean, one of the things that comes out of all this for me is the importance of acknowledging our ignorance at all times. That we're always going to be struggling with these things, and it's always going to be work. That, and like any relationship, the work is what defines it. And so we always have to be questioning, always have to be returning to where are we out of congruence? Where are the gaps today? And how are we going to fix that? What are we going to do to be more congruent in the moment and never give up on that?
And it's not more work, because that work will save time in all the churn that happens when you have miscommunication and all of that quality.
You had content training?
Hashy.
The idea, right? It's like, spend a little more time now. It saves you all of these misunderstandings and rework later, right?
I guess one of the other ways to detect incongruence is conflicting requests in a system. The requests that are literally almost negating each other. And are repetitive in nature, but they're coming from different points of view, which means they haven't talked to each other.
Or if they're bouncing Jiras, stop.
Yes.
Incongruence.
Yes.
Bring people together and not just point to point in and around. It's like bring people together. Let's kind of
Yes,
understand.
and we have thresholds for different things, right? And it's like, hey, there's 20 bugs that just came in. It's like, what's going on?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I have the wrong build. or some database connection died.
Right.
It's like, stop entering bugs.
Right.
You know, talk to someone and say, hey, something's weird going on.
Solve the
here,
problem.
right? So at some point we say, stop using an inefficient communication method, come and talk to a human and say, I think something's going wrong here. We should try and understand. Yes.
So one of the interesting things is, I think it's 60, 70 years old, the communication loop. As a pattern, we are only using one part of it. So you need the feedback that actually you received information, because what you say, what you intend, and what I'm hearing and interpreting that I'm hearing might be two different things. So as a receiver, part of it is on me to say, so what you are saying is da-da-da. On the other hand, if I don't hear it as a sender, so can you tell me what you think I want from you? And this is one missing part that I hardly see these days.
Yes.
Can you tell me what you think I want from you?
Yeah. Or even the simple things of how do you think you're going to get to do this? And then that will kind of involve a more elaborate response where I want to hear also how you think about it.
I like that.
But that's too much.
Time.
Right. Well, yeah, well, that's it.